Good afternoon. This is Lisa Dulski-Watkins with the Milbank Memorial Fund. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today. This is one of a series of informational gatherings where we have experts describing their experience working with aspects that relate to the Comprehensive Primary Care Plus initiative. I'm just going to give folks a few more moments to dial in. We have about 15 people on the line. I expect a few additional ones, so you'll just indulge us for 1 or 2 more minutes. We'll get started shortly. Okay, so I think we'd like to get started. Welcome again. This is Lisa Dulski-Watkins with the Milbank Memorial Fund, and we are having our monthly informational webinar starting right now. Just a little bit of housekeeping. If you are on the phone or using your computer, please mute yourself when you're not speaking. It just helps with the quality of the sound for our presenters. If you have noticed, there is a chat function on the right lower corner of your screen. You should be able to get access to that. You can send messages to anyone as a group or privately if you wish. And we're trying to use that as to make sure that we get all our questions logged in just in case we don't have a chance to ask them directly to the presenters. So with that, I'd like to welcome everyone. Just one other piece of information is that this entire event is being recorded, and we have started archiving materials and webinar recordings on our website at the Milbank Memorial Fund website, our multi-payer primary care transformation page. So and you can certainly review this again if you wish, or share it with your colleagues. So I would like to take this opportunity to introduce you to our wonderful presenters. Both Grace Anglin and Erin Taylor have been working with Mathematica for several years now and are responsible for a great deal of the excellent evaluation ongoing process of the comprehensive primary care activity, both in terms of the now ended CPCI, the original classic version of the Comprehensive Primary Care Initiative, and also are continuing to work with the CPC Plus moving forward. Today they're going to be discussing the Year 3 evaluation report, giving some basic lessons that really came out of the CPCI and describing that, and then they will be also focusing a bit on the implementation process with a little bit of an eye to the self-insured book of business, which is certainly something that has become of great interest to everyone. So with that, I'd like to turn the microphone, as it were, over to our colleagues at Mathematica, and I'll turn it over to both Erin and Grace. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for inviting us today, Lisa. This is Erin Taylor, and as you mentioned, my colleague Grace Anglin is also on the phone, as well as Debbie Pikus, who serves as the project director on the evaluation of both CPC and CPC Plus. So we are really excited to tell you a little bit about what we've learned from the CPC evaluation up and through the Year 3 annual report. And we're just picking up sort of a few pieces of that. I believe that Lisa may have shared with you a link to the 3 prior annual reports that we've done. But we're also very excited to hear perspectives and insights from folks on the phone today. Great. Now, Lisa, did you want me to go ahead and did we want to do this sort of as a question and answer format, or should I just go ahead and sort of lay out some of the lessons that we've learned?
Why don't you just, if you're okay with that, I'd rather sort of follow your flow in terms of the things that you wanted to address. So that would be, if that's okay.
Okay, sure. The first thing that we thought we'd share with you is some lessons as we think through the CPC evaluation about what we really learned about CPC's multi-payer collaboration. And I'm hearing a little bit of feedback. Is someone, I'm not sure who it is, but can someone mute?
Yeah, it sounds like they just did. Great.
Okay, perfect.
I'll mute myself as well. So.
Okay, great. So this first question really has to do around sort of CPC's multi-payer collaboration and what we really sort of took away in terms of lessons from that. So in our evaluation of what we're now calling CPC Classic, we examined the effect of multi-payer collaboration on CPC implementation in each of CPC's 7 regions, and how payers came together to enhance their support to practices for changing care delivery. So specifically, we studied CPC collaboration activities through, regular observation of multi-payer and multi-stakeholder meetings, as well as qualitative data collection through annual interviews with participating payers, practices, and a number of other stakeholders. We analyzed these data by region and across the initiative as a whole to describe the collaborative dynamics and outcomes and really assess the factors that we thought were influencing those dynamics and outcomes. So before I go any further, I should make clear that today I'm speaking today drawing from our experience evaluating CPC, but I'm not speaking on behalf of CMS. So let us share some of our findings with you. So some of you may be very aware that there are 54 payers participating in CPC Plus. CPC Classic had 39 payers at the start, and that number ranged from 3 to 10 payers depending on the region, per region depending on the region. So one of the most notable outcomes from our perspective of CPC's multi-payer collaboration was really the development of unified performance feedback reports. And these unified reports took one of 2 forms. First, either aggregating payers' data together into a single combined report, which 3 of the 7 CPC regions achieved, or simply the payers in a given region simply agreeing to report the same measures in their individual performance reports, which 2 of the regions pursued. And I think it's worth noting that a number of the stakeholders described data aggregation as a potential game changer. So most notably, practices in regions with a number of different payers rather than say just 1 or 2 dominant payers found that unified feedback reports most useful. So early in CPC, before unified feedback reports were developed, practices often had to review, a half dozen or more feedback reports, each reporting on different metrics. So that was pretty onerous from the practice's perspective. But sort of, working towards aggregation and pulling claims data together across payers was also a challenging task. And it took 2.5 years for the first region to deliver an aggregated report to practices. So aligned quality measures was another focus of CPC's multi-payer collaboration. And each of the 7 CPC regions successfully reached agreement on a common set of metrics. But I think it's worth noting that agreeing on aligned metrics was challenging, given that participating payers serve a number of different enrolled populations. For example, the aligned measures that were selected for CPC placed a heavy emphasis on metrics relevant primarily for the Medicare population. And some payers, such as Medicaid managed care plans, probably would have preferred more metrics relevant to the populations they serve, such as children. In part because of these concerns, only about half of the payers that shared savings with practices in CPC ultimately used the aligned measures to determine practices' eligibility to receive shared savings. So while CPC saw important progress on aligning quality measures across payers, I suspect this may be an area in CPC Plus where there may be more of a movement to try to include metrics relevant to a wider set of enrolled populations. Turning to another area for payer collaboration, a number of patients and practices in CPC reported that their patients were confused by the presence of multiple care managers. That is, care managers both at the practice and perhaps care managers calling from insurers or hospitals. So this is another area where we think there might be some room for developing an approach here for coordinating with practices' care managers. And finally, CPC practices also struggled to arrange health information exchange with hospitals and ERs so that they could learn when their patients were admitted and discharged and provide transitional care. So looking to the future, to CPC Plus and other initiatives, this is an area where there's room for payers either in feeding this information directly to practices or perhaps brokering a common approach between hospitals and practices so that practices in a given region don't have to figure out this for themselves. Okay. Next, we thought it might be useful to turn to the topic of did we learn of any common requests from practices for payer coordination that payers weren't able to achieve, and if so, what were the barriers? So I'll say from the get-go here that CPC practices were not necessarily making direct requests for payers to, coordinate their efforts, though payers often did seek input from practices along the way. So more typical than requesting coordinated efforts, practices pushed individual payers for things like timely performance feedback, or they maybe questioned why some payers offered lower care management fees than others. And that said, practices recognized and appreciated that payers were really coming together to align incentives and encourage practices to work towards CPC's goals of better care, smarter spending, and healthier people. But I did want to share sort of one notable example of payers requesting practices requesting payer coordination. And this is in the area of the unified performance feedback reports, which I mentioned earlier. Many practices really like the idea of this. And most payers in most regions that aggregated data or at least aligned their individual feedback reports sought input from practices on both the structure of those reports and the content of them. So as one example, in Arkansas, payers started providing practices with patient-level data files in addition to the practice-level reports after practices indicated that those files would be useful. Now, it's also worth noting that not all regions were able to make progress in this area, and we wanted to sort of point out some specific barriers to payer progress on data aggregation. These included just the time and the prep work taking considerably longer than originally anticipated. There was also some anxiety among some payers that they might bear a disproportionate share of the data aggregation costs. There were concerns around sharing proprietary payment data with a vendor. You know, for a time in CPC, there was uncertainty about Medicare's participation in data aggregation. And finally, there were, of course, as expected, concerns about whether payers would realize a positive return on investment in data aggregation during the course of the initiative. We've also spent a fair amount of time thinking about the successes and challenges with payer collaboration and what factors really played into helping or hindering that collaboration. So as we you know, thought through what factors really helped spur collaborative success in CPC regions, we found that two factors really appear to play probably the most important role. And the first factor is in CPC, each region had a facilitator that convened payers or other stakeholders. And strong leadership from that facilitator we found really played a key role. And more specifically, the most effective facilitators served much more than a logistical or administrative role, such as scheduling meetings or taking notes. Instead, effective payer facilitators really thought strategically about how to foster positive working relationships among payers by, for example, developing maybe a formal charter that helps payers establish specific goals and take concrete steps towards them. So as we think ahead to future work like CPC Plus, it might definitely be worth payers pitching in to fund a facilitator in such initiatives. The second factor that we think is really key and critical to collaborative success involves payers that had previously collaborated in a region, and in those regions in which this sort of prior collaboration had taken place, we found more productive collaborations based on those relationships, especially in the first year or two of CPC. So, you know, ultimately regions that lacked, you know, the strong facilitator and prior collaboration experience generally saw less engagement among payers and perhaps were not quite as successful in making progress towards collaborative outcomes such as, you know, unified performance feedback. I just want to mention a couple other factors that we also think help strengthen. Yes? Was there a comment? Okay, I'll keep going. Just a couple other factors that we think can help strengthen collaboration. One is that in most of the CPC regions, we really found that there was a payer champion that emerged. And by that, I mean a leader of one of the participating payer organizations that sort of emerged organically as the group came together and then really pushed the other payers along. And these payer champions played an important role keeping individual payer organizations and regions engaged in CPC despite, you know, the ever-present competing organizational priorities. And I'll note here that the payer champion was usually not pushing a particular approach or strategy used by his or her organization, but rather just, you know, encouraging others to remain engaged and, continue making progress. And it's worth noting that many of the national payers usually had to align with their organization's corporate-wide strategy rather than pursue approaches similar to what other payers were doing in the region. So with that, we'd like to kind of turn to yet another topic, and that's one that we know has been a thorny issue for many payers. And it's really the question of, how to engage self-insured clients in primary care transformation efforts. So we wanted to tell you a little bit about what we learned on this topic, since it is such an important one. And for this one, I'd like to turn it to my colleague, Grace Anglin, who's really spearheaded our understanding of the self-insured participation for the CPC evaluation. So, Grace?
Yeah, thanks, Erin. So I'm going to just start by saying that while most participating payers included all or at least most of their lines of business in CPC, we did see a lot more variation in the extent to which payers were able to include their self-insured clients in the program.
Hi, Grace. Grace, this is Lisa. Yeah. I'm having a lot of trouble hearing you. Do you mind maybe adjusting your microphone a little bit?
Okay, is this better?
That is so much better. Yes, thank you.
Okay, I'm not sure what was happening, but I'm glad that you can hear me better now. Okay, so
absolutely. Do you mind repeating what you just said? That would be helpful.
Yeah, I'll start over. Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you.
So I was just saying that while most participating payers generally included most of their lines of business in CPC, we did see a lot more variation in the extent to which commercial payers were able to include self-insured clients in the initiative. That said, from the start of CPC, most payers did see the inclusion of self-insured entities as really important, if not critical, for the success of not just CPC, but multi-payer primary care transformation efforts more broadly. And this is especially viewed as important given that the self-insured population represents more than half of all commercially insured individuals in the United States. So bringing those lives into an initiative and paying enhanced payments for them can really increase the strength of a program. However, payers did find that gaining self-insured participation in CPC was difficult, and this was due mostly to self-insured entities' reluctance to join a new initiative without really having clear evidence of a positive return on investment for their organization. Now, a secondary challenge for payers, which existed mostly early on in CPC, is that self-insured entities initially were not familiar with CPC specifically, and so payers had to engage them and educate them about the work. Now, over the course of CPC, a number of payers did work pretty hard to overcome these challenges and increase their self-insured participation in CPC. So just to give you a sense of how self-insured participation changed over time, at the start of the initiative, there were 26 payers with self-insured clients. And among these 26 payers, the number reporting at least some self-insured participation in CPC specifically increased from 14 payers at the beginning of the initiative to 19 by 2015. And similarly, the number of payers reporting either full self-insured participation or almost reaching that full self-insured participation increased from 7 payers at the start of the initiative to 13 by 2013. And I do want to put in, I guess, another plug for our annual reports, and Erin mentioned. So you can find more details on this topic as well as payer and multi-payer collaboration in general in those annual reports. Self-insured participation specifically is covered in Chapter 2, and multi-payer collaboration is covered in Chapter 4. And in the report on self-insured participation, we describe more details about how it evolved over time, as well as identify several factors that contributed to payers gaining self-insured participation, and I'll highlight some of those for you now. So most importantly, payers indicated that demonstrating the potential benefits of CPC and how it might result in a positive return on investment for self-insured clients was critical to gaining as well as sustaining their support for the initiative. So at the start of CPC, most payers used what we call an opt-in model in which they proactively invited self-insured clients to participate in CPC. And this payers most often held individual discussions with each client to discuss the initiative with them and encourage them to join. But payers indicated that these conversations were hard to have without evidence of CPC's effectiveness, and thus they were only able to enroll a subset of their clients. Now, a few payers used more active engagement strategies from the start of CPC, and these included either requiring all of their self-insured clients to participate in CPC or automatically enrolling self-insured entities unless they expressly opted out of the initiative. And these payers did experience considerably more success in gaining self-insured participation, but they also indicated that clients continued to ask them for outcomes data and might discontinue their participation in practice transformation efforts without it. So at the start of CPC, in the absence of data on its effectiveness specifically, most payers educated employers on evidence supporting the patient-centered medical home model, which is similar to the CPC model, as well as on the expected outcomes from CPC. Now, in a few regions, payers actually worked together and or collaborated with stakeholders in their region to engage self-insured clients and illustrate CPC's theory of change. So for example, in the Ohio-Kentucky region, payers and self-insured clients who had already agreed to participate in the initiative formed an employer committee, which planned educational opportunities for employers that were not yet participating in the initiative. So these opportunities included, for example, scheduled tours of CPC practices to show non-participating employers the types of changes that CPC practices were making that would impact the quality, that could potentially impact the quality and cost of care for their employees. Now, as CPC progressed and payers started to see some improvements in outcomes, they noted that self-insured clients had keen interest in these results. And it was fairly rare, but a few payers did actually develop reports or tools to help them track the return on investment of CPC or specific outcomes actually at the employer level. And two of the payers that developed these tools actually credited them for their increases in self-insured participation. And I also wanted to note that as educational efforts started to take hold and self-insured groups generally became more comfortable with CPC and other practice transformation efforts, additional payers in CPC started to move from that opt-in policy to requiring self-insured participation. And this switch helped to increase the overall participation of self-insured clients in the initiative. Now, at the start of CPC, those payers who right off the bat started using these active engagement strategies tended to be larger payers or national payers, and were also concentrated in just a few of the CPC markets. And payers in other regions at the start of CPC were concerned that using these kind of aggressive active engagement strategies might actually result in them losing some self-insured business. Though I do want to note that we didn't hear from any payers that this actually did occur throughout the initiative. But anyway, as payers and self-insured entities became more comfortable with CPC, they felt that they could move to these more active engagement strategies. So just to sort of wrap up, increasing self-insured participation was facilitated both by payers making CPC participation the default for their clients, as well as sharing favorable results with their clients. So now we wanted to sort of switch and I guess in a sense wrap up by providing some suggestions for how future So some recommendations that future multi-payer efforts might want to consider as they're moving forward. And I'm going to turn this back over to Erin to wrap us up here.
Great. Thanks, Grace. So yes, thinking about future initiatives and what recommendations really can't come out of what we saw. Several come to mind here, and let me start with the one that's quite obvious, and it's simply getting as many payers as involved as possible. That's really important. You know, as you all know, the greater the proportion of a practice's lives that are covered in these types of initiatives, the more leverage is available for aligning incentives and really changing care delivery. And related to this, it's important that payers don't lose sight of self-insured lives. As Grace already discussed with you, in many markets, self-insured lives make up a large proportion of the commercial age population. And in those types of regions, not having self-insured lives in an initiative can really have an impact on the level of funding available to practices to support practice transformation. The second recommendation is to identify your goals, which might include unified performance feedback to practices, aligned ways of measuring quality and rewarding performance, perhaps ways to promote information exchange between hospitals and ERs and practices, and ways to coordinate care managers reaching out to patients, as we mentioned before. A third recommendation is consider hiring a strong neutral facilitator to support transformation efforts in a region. Stakeholders in many CPC regions believed that having a multi-payer or multi-stakeholder facilitator was really key to their success. A facilitator typically developed agendas, convened and led meetings, and worked with payers as needed on a one-on-one basis, and generally just helped everyone stay on the same page and you know, drive the progress of the group. And particularly effective facilitators worked to gain payers or other participants' trust. They fostered working relationships with and among stakeholders. They broke down broad initiative goals into more concrete, achievable goals, and they identified, when needed, you know, constructive steps to overcome barriers and make progress towards goals. A fourth recommendation is try to have realistic expectations about what you can achieve over a given time horizon. And let us give you one example of this. In the case of aggregated performance feedback, again, which involves, you know, aggregating claims data across payers into a single report, participating payers really have to be willing to commit the time and the financial resources to the process, given that you know, the necessary steps of vendor selection, contractual arrangements, and governance structure simply take time to work through. And given that the costs of aggregation are typically split across payers, you know, typically proportional to the number of attributed lives they have in a region, waning commitment by one or more payers over time can have a big effect on whether or not a region can pull off aggregation. And, you know, if one or two payers do decide to pull out, there can be a domino effect. So that's important to think about. A final recommendation, our experience on the evaluation suggests that payers should try to coordinate as much as possible with, other concurrent regional initiatives. We say that, and then at the same time, we understand that CMS and some national payers may not be able to do this for various reasons. In some CPC regions, other primary care transformation efforts and health information exchanges were also underway and often involved many of the same stakeholders as CPC. In cases where there was a lack of alignment and coordination across these concurrent initiatives, this really served to increase administrative burden, frustration, and confusion for practices. And conversely, to the extent that that initiatives can coordinate on and work towards common goals, this alignment really provided a clearer and stronger signal to providers about what they should be working toward. And so I think that's it as far as our prepared comments. But let me turn it over to Debbie Pikus. And Debbie, I just wanted to give you a chance if you had anything to add.
Oh, thanks, Erin. Really happy to have our group invited to share our lessons learned about payer involvement. Just wanted to say this is a really exciting time for primary care, and we hope these lessons learned from the evaluation of CPC will help guide you as you embark on CPC Plus and other initiatives to strengthen primary care and improve patient outcomes. And we're looking forward to your questions and feedback.
Thank you. Thanks to, this is Lisa. Thanks everybody. Really appreciate the thought that went into this wonderful presentation. And it's, the reports can be daunting to read through and look at, so it's very helpful to have important pieces pulled out in these common threads. So I would like to just sort of turn it over to our collected colleagues on the phone, and if people please feel free to speak up. You should be able to unmute yourself. So just give that a moment before I have some questions I can jump in with, but I'd like to give people a chance first. So maybe this is Lisa again. I guess I'll sort of step in and press you a little bit about the self-insured piece, because I think this is a question that certainly everyone is interested in. Our colleagues at CMS are keenly interested in. Would you mind try to maybe give us a couple of more concrete details about what appear to be palatable in terms of the sort of pressure, if you will, that had to be exerted in order for there to be sort of maximized participation? Because I think it's a fine line that one has to walk in order to not be pushing people so far that they just want to walk away, or to not be clear enough that there really are potential advantages.
Yeah, I can jump in here, Lisa. I think what I would say is basically that you're right. It is a hard line to walk, and because of that, I think that's part of the reason that payers who ended up just coming to their clients and saying, we as an organization just really believe that this is the way forward, and this is, what we as a payer believe in is, improving primary care, and that this is how we're going to get better quality and lower costs, and therefore we're putting everybody in unless you have a concern, kind of that opt-out model, or slightly less used, but just you're in no matter what. If you're agreeing to use us as your third-party administrator, then this is part of what you're buying, is this what we consider improved approach to primary care. Tended to be the most effective. I would say that even throughout the course of the initiative, that payers who really went one by one to employers and tried to get their agreement to join on, continued to sort of face the same challenges. I will note that there were certain types of payers who were, a certain type of self-insured entities who were more likely to be amenable to those conversations. It seemed like health systems themselves. So if a payer was insuring, a large hospital system, they tended to be more likely to join on. The same for public employers, so school systems or county employees were also more likely to join the initiatives. I think for the former, it might have been because there was, a greater understanding by health systems of the potential impact of this work, and for the latter, oftentimes states' Medicaid programs are also moving in a similar direction, and therefore there's just a general willingness to accept this type of work. But really the payers, like I said, who had the most success were the ones that just said, we believe strongly in this. This is what we're doing. We hope you'll come along. And at least the payers and CPC, there was initially some worry that they might get pushback from clients, but no one reported sort of ultimately losing any business as a result of that strategy. I don't know, Erin, if you wanted to add anything.
No, that was great, Grace.
So there's an element of a leap of faith that people are being asked to make. And
yeah, I think that's right.
But that was true before the self-insured side of things also. 10 years ago, when some of these, in different regions and states, there was this early work going on, and there was this sort of push and pull up about that because we didn't have any evidence yet to prove that. Would you say that the opportunity for people who were either employers or payers to actually observe what was going on in the practices that had undergone some transformation, how that was received and how was that actually accomplished? And was it sort of shadowing, or was it, presentations? How was that? Do you have some sense of how that actually occurred?
Yeah, I don't have a lot of details on this, but I know generally how it was approached. It was a fairly unique strategy used in Ohio and Kentucky. So if there are any payers on the phone from those regions that want to jump in, please do. But my understanding is that there were a few large employers in Ohio and Kentucky who joined CPC fairly early in the initiative, and there were multi-stakeholder meetings in Ohio. So when payers came together to meet, starting pretty early in the initiative, they started to engage other groups in those meetings as well. So they brought in CPC practices, but also employers and other stakeholders to attend all the meetings in which payers were discussing all types of things, not just self-insured participation, but also their data aggregation efforts, for example. And from those meetings, payers and self-insured entities started to think about how can we get more employers to the table. And I think it was actually even the idea of the employers. I think it was employer-driven, that it would be helpful to bring, other employers in the market to actually see the changes taking place in practices. So like I said, payers also were developing pretty good relationships with practices at the time. So it was an opportunity for them to actually go and visit the CPC practices. So less of a presentation, but actually kind of like a site visit, go to the practice and see and hear about the types of changes that they're making.
Thank you, Grace. Yeah, I think that tells a story in a really important way when you have that opportunity. So it seems like an important piece. Any other questions on the phone before I launch into something else I'm interested in? A lot of people have muted yourselves, and if you're talking and not able to be heard, please unmute yourself. So one of the other areas that you gave us some helpful information on, and I want to explore a little bit further, was around the data aggregation and the collaborative efforts that happened in a couple of places to create that, with payers all contributing their data, but also having to contribute money to essentially create a unified source. I know that an example of that certainly is in Colorado. I don't think we actually have any payers on the phone from Colorado, although Randy Evans, who works with the Center for Evidence-Based Policy in Oregon, is on the line and perhaps could give us a little background information. Randy, do you mind just, if you're still actually with us, addressing that a little bit? It's been a remarkable multi-payer collaborative effort in Colorado.
This is Samantha from the Center for Evidence-Based Policy.
Hi, Samantha. Welcome.
Yes, hi, thanks. We've been working with the Colorado payers since the beginning of CPC in 2012. And I'm not sure, Lisa, was there something kind of specific that you were looking for? I think this group has heard a lot about the multi-payer collaborative there, so I don't want to bore anybody.
Right. No, thank you. And but I do think that we actually have there's a fair number of people who are relatively new to the process, Samantha. So if you don't mind, maybe just a sort of brief overview. You don't need to go into any great detail, but I think there really has been, it's been a demonstrable success, and I guess that's something that would be helpful for people to just get a broad overview. It's a great group of folks who've been working together there in Colorado. It really started part of CPC, but the collaborative has grown to expand into other areas. So they also work on their SIM project, and the multi-payer collaborative there has also been successful in aggregating data and have a data aggregation project that expands into CPC Plus and their SIM folks. The payers there meet monthly. They're in person every other month. They're on the phone on the months that they're not able to meet together. And they're a really dedicated group who has really been able to, I think the key for them is being able to be dual citizens, which is how we talk about it. They're able to not only represent their organizations at the table with other payers, but they're also able to represent that collaborative back to their organizations, which is a kind of tricky balancing act, I think, sometimes. They have a great process that they've developed. Part of that was through a charter where they have a shared vision. They have really clear governance and decision-making protocols. They have processes in place for dealing with conflict or areas that are a little bit trickier. And I think they've been very successful in working through the challenges that are inherent in these types of collaborations and continuing to evolve as a group and strengthen those relationships. They're able to really help each other when there is something that comes up at an individual organization that's a challenge, whether that's participating in a specific initiative or something specific to an initiative, to really work with each other to collaboratively problem solve and support each other through those processes. But having that shared vision and that dedication to improving the health of all Coloradans is at the base of everything that they're doing, and I think makes a great difference. I hope that's helpful and not just too general. No, that's very helpful. Thank you, Sam. So maybe I could turn this back to the Mathematica team in terms of some of the things you might have observed specifically in Colorado that really struck you, or maybe talk about the process in Ohio where there's also some success with that.
I guess I just reiterate, the number of steps that our region needs to prepare themselves for when they decide to pursue data aggregation. And as you just heard from Sam, they're sort of developing the governance structure, the charter, getting everyone on the same page, the contracting, the vendor selection, and eventually getting Medicare there. It just is very, very time consuming. So that's trying to set realistic expectations around that, and having facilitators try to manage those expectations, I think is key. Another thing I'll throw out, and Sam can speak to this too, I think I'd love to hear perspectives on this, is that the other thing we sort of have to get our heads around in terms of realistic expectations is once you get to the point of aggregating data, that first time you do it, it's a big, it's a big threshold you've made it over when you aggregate data, but the work isn't done. And I do think Colorado can probably speak to this, that there's a lot, and we've heard this from Ohio and Oklahoma as well, that there is a big process of sort of refining measures and, trying to make sure that everything across the payers, the various payers data has been done consistently, and exclusion criteria, and lots of different sort of data pieces that sort of, I think several of the regions have found themselves sort of refining over time. That first cut of the aggregated data may not be the best cut of the aggregated data, and then they see it and they realize how they can sort of clean it up over time, if you will. And then there's the question that everyone struggles with data feedback is you get all that aggregated data together, which is a huge success, but then you have to figure out what and how much you share with practices. I know we've heard at points that when the data have been aggregated, the practices have been completely overwhelmed with everything that's put in front of them. It's great that the data are there, but sometimes we sort of need to figure out how to narrow it down for that practice that can only wants that high level view of the data, but also eventually make the data accessible for much sort of deeper dives for that very sophisticated practice that wants to see everything. So there's always, I think, a lot of data refinement even after the process sort of gets going and is in place. And Sam, I don't know if you have any reaction to that or anything you want to add.
Yeah, no, I think that you captured a lot of it. The data aggregation piece is huge. And I will say the payers in Colorado often talk about that project for them as being a catalyst for really forming their group, because it was such a challenging thing to go through as a group, and it really required people to not only be able to, again, not only represent your own organization's interests, but to represent the interests of this collaborative and these initiatives and kind of what was better for overall. And it is a very challenging and very difficult process. And so for the folks that went through it, they learned a lot, and it really solidified their commitment to the project and to the process. And it helped them develop a lot of processes throughout that around decision making and governance and problem solving. And I think the points you raised about the ongoing need for data quality, that is an ongoing piece of data aggregation, and it's something that requires a lot of communication with practices. I think there was this big excitement that we have aggregated data and the tools there, and yay, and having to also continually communicate and work with expectations around what does it mean, and it's a process not only on the payer side, but with practices and having mechanisms in place to collect that feedback and continue to make those improvements. Thanks,
both of you. I guess that this points to a pretty important need around a facilitator and the role there, and that, as everyone knows, in CPC Plus, we no longer have that as part of the infrastructure, although there's a lot of effort and successfully pulling together some excellent facilitation support in most of the regions that we know about. And then the other piece is that there is this, the data contract that that is in the hands of Deloitte, and then with some very skilled subcontractors, it seems like there is technical assistance. And as this the CPC Plus rolls out, seeing how that's utilized and refining that to meet the needs of the regions is going to be very important. Any other questions or comments from our audience? Okay. Well, I want to take this opportunity once again to thank our wonderful colleagues at Mathematica for doing wonderful work in the first place, and also your willingness to share that with us in this environment. We'll continue to have these monthly webinars. We're working on our content for the one at the end of April. I would like to announce that we have to shift a little bit in terms of the Zoom technology and specifically the links that will be used for future meetings. So just as a basic piece of information, whenever you are signing on to one of these webinars, please use the most recent updated invitation that you have in your calendar for that specific date to make sure that you have the right link. We'll be sending out email information supporting that statement that I just made. It will not be at all confusing, but we just want to make sure that you have access to the correct information as we plan these. And please feel free to reach out to me anytime in terms of ideas of topics that you would like to see covered. We have a wide range of latitude around how we do these webinars, and I really want to make sure that I'm meeting everyone's needs as best we possibly can. Thanks so much again to our team from Mathematica, and thank you for everyone for dialing in today. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.